I've got the privilege of kicking off session 2, which is all about the Central Highlands. And with that, I'm going to start clicking through. So I'll be talking about Silver Plains and one of our new projects that we've got that brings a whole lot of our management and research together. And we've just clicked through. I'd like to acknowledge the Larramarina people as the traditional custodians of Silver Plains and really recognise their continuing connection to country, the land, the waters and their culture. This is really my first introduction to Silver Plains, and it's one of our ex-forestry properties. It's got smaller eucalypts, has a lot of fallen timber on the ground, and initially a little bit confronting, but it grows on you and it really gets into your soul because it also still has really large trees left. It has really big open marshes that occupy 10% of the landmass of Silver Plains. So that's the whole property is 6,500 or 6,700 hectares, and then it's pocketed in with threatened ecological communities and these marshes, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So where are we talking about? We're up on the Highlands. We're near Interlaken and on the northern boundary of Lake Sorell. We're surrounded mostly by forestry, also grazing and parks to the east. Silver Plains, even though it has been one of our ex-forestry properties, it's a carbon property, it's also been a real hub for TLC, both with our management. There's been really long-term weed management, deer management, but it's also one of our unofficial science hubs. It's where 3 of our longest standing research partnerships have been occurring, and you'll hear from 3 additional speakers today who'll talk to the first 2 projects, so UTAS and the Australian Mountain Research Facility, and then the ARC linkage with the Deer project, and we've already heard Dave talk about our Quoll project. And it's through these really long-standing conservation management and research projects that it really facilitated our biggest project that we've got coming up, which is our Ian Potter Foundation grant. And so that one's all about building that ecosystem resilience across the property, and actually marrying the two. So marrying the conservation management and the research. And to me, it's all about that partnership. So we've got 11 partners, and whether that ranges from government, non-government, community groups, hunters, and not-for-profit. There's 4 big actions across that project. And the first one that's really going to kick off is a big restoration of our marshes. So we're going to be working with Nature Glenelg Trust to undertake the hydrological restoration on these marshes. And that's really important because when you start walking around in wetlands, you notice that a lot of them have drains coming out of them. And as our climate warms or dries, they're increasingly losing that water in the system. And this is going to be no small task because there's over 20 kilometres of drains that are through that property. And so over the following 2 years, we're going to be working to remove those drains. And so to really assess what the impact of that restoration is, it's through our partnerships. So it's working with the University of Tasmania, and you'll be hearing from Natasha and Beth about their project in just a minute. And I'm really excited to be working with Michael Chatterton with his PhD, and we'll hear from him next year. The other one of our other key conservation targets that we're really interested in their response to the restoration is our Latham snipe. So Latham snipe is a migratory species. It's nationally vulnerable. It comes down from Japan and it comes down, to Tasmania in the summer or across the eastern seaboard. And it's really focused in on our wetlands. So it's one of those species that has been threatened in the past by hunting, and now it's through habitat loss. And so places like Silver Plains, which is one of the few subalpine areas that the bird comes to, are really important. So over the years, we've been working with a number of volunteers that's really been driven by those people. So Ian Stewart, also the department, to monitor the species coming into Bucks Marsh, which is on Silver Plains. And what you can see in those first 2 columns is in our wetter years, we're getting a lot out in Bucks Marsh, And then the numbers kind of drop off as we've come into some of our drier years. We're not recording them so much in January where the property is reasonably dry. Now, they might actually just be using the other wetlands or marshlands around the property. So this is not indicative of the whole one. We're really excited to be partnering up with Federation University this year and master's student Sandra Leclerc and her supervisor, Dr. Bakita Hansen. So together they're going to be doing the pre-restoration survey to understand what are our baselines, where are the birds using, is it within Bucks Marsh or is it a bit further afield? And then this will move on to help inform our GPS tracking projects, which will be looking at more detailed use from the snipe, both for feeding and also for roosting. The second major goal is looking at how do we identify and implement the most cost-effective method for reducing our deer across our property. Now, as we've all been hearing, there's an increasingly large focus on deer management, and there's been a real step up in how people are actioning control and changing those methods. And we'll hear from two of our other speakers in just a minute about some of the work that's been going on. So for us, it's about building on our knowledge from both the research projects that have already occurred, so those ARC linkages, and also from the local knowledge. And then it's about working up and stepping up our pressure. So looking to work with our recreational hunters, our conservation hunters, and into the future, the professional hunters. But the most important bit is understanding how this change in pressure affects our management on the property, acknowledging that we've got leaky boundaries. So we've got deer infiltrating from either side. And what is the most effective way to manage them going forward? And then importantly, it's about sharing that. So how do we implement that across our reserves and also work with our neighbours to take those lessons on? This third main conservation action that will fit within this big project is looking at the weed management. So a number of you would have been part of some of these Central Highlands weeding programs. It's been going since 2012. So there's been 12 years of annual work out on the property. It has a huge amount of volunteer effort. So anywhere from 5 to 20 volunteers are out there, and they've been working to really scour that property. And so when we look at the Silver Plains, you can see there's really consistent mapping that's happening across that property. And if we look on the map, the yellow is our ragwort. So it's a disturbance respondence weed. And what we can see in this graph, I should have had ragwort in yellow, but that's our red one. And you can see actually there's step changes when we change our recording methods. So here in 2021, we had this big spike up in the population. It also coincided with when we were doing better recording. And so the other positive thing that we can start to take away is we can see a general tick down. And that's important when you've got something like a disturbance respondent weed. It's pretty, it's an ongoing process. So we want to bring the results together. Each year we use it to inform where we're going to go the following year, but it's bringing all this information together and actually providing it out into the community as well. I suppose the biggest thing about the Ian Potter grant and the opportunity that it provides us is it's all about sharing. So this is an open invitation to join us. Come and be part of our demonstration days. Come and have a look at what we're doing with the hydrological restoration, the deer control. Come and contribute to ideas, and then or be part of our weeding events. So later in the day, if you want to be part, come and chat to me, and we'll get you onto the mailing list. And yeah, be part of it. That's it. I was going to just quietly sit down and take myself away. Anyway, turns out I'm chairing this session. Okay, so the next, our next speaker is Natasha, a PhD candidate with the University of Tasmania. And I'm really excited to see the work that Natasha's been doing with the soil carbon and how that links into what we're doing here at Silver Plains and what we can learn from that.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, as Kath said, I will be talking about the soil carbon storage up in the highlands and specifically in the Silver Plains area on Box Marsh, where we've got this warming experiment that those of you who have been up there has definitely seen, because you can't really avoid it. So first of all, I would like to just acknowledge the Laramarinia people as the traditional custodians of the land, where I conduct my fieldwork. And I want to really thank them, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to learn from the natural environment, and I'm committed to treating this land with the respect it deserved. So, the Silver Plains area, you have already introduced where it is, so that's it, that's up there near Lake Sorrel. And this marshland is really high in organic carbon. And that means that it's a really very chocolate cakey soil that you find up there that has this peaty nature. And this happens when the carbon input is higher than the carbon output. Now, the carbon input we have up there, just to give you a bit of background, that is mainly from dead biomass coming from the grass and the other plants that grows up in the marshlands. And the outputs then appear or come from the respiration from the plants and from the microbes. So mostly from little microbes chewing away at the carbon down in the soil. So these two pools are determined by mainly temperature and soil moisture, which regulates this respiration process and which regulates how these microbes, how active they are. So we've got our balance basically up here. And what is the really interesting thing to find out for me is whether we tip one way or another in terms of whether we are still storing carbon up in the highlands. So what I want to find out is what conditions and what mechanisms control these conditions for tipping this balance between a carbon sink and a carbon source. Right, so 10 years ago, my supervisor and another team was very smart to put up these open top chambers. And what they do is that they passively heat the air about 2 degrees above the ambient temperature. So this simulates a climate warming experiment. 2 years ago, another set of chambers were put in, which means that we both have the short-term effect and a long-term effect. And this is really important for looking at soil systems, because I was noticing before you talked about a slow response in plant talking 2 years, but that's like the blink of an eye talking about soil, because we're talking very long-term changes. So what I did was, for last year, every month I went out and I measured the CO2 efflux. Now that is the CO2 content in the gas that is coming out of the soil, and that basically represents how much the microbes are munching away. So what we see on the graph here is at the soil temperature, we have with an increased soil temperature, we have an increase in the soil efflux. So the respiration goes up as the soil temperature goes up. But also we see that the yellow and the red points, they're the warmed. So at the same temperature, the warmed plots actually efflux more carbon than the unwarmed. Now, I also measured the water content of the soil. And interestingly, it doesn't look like there's the same sort of response across the whole level of range of water contents, but certainly at low water contents, there is an increase in efflux from the warm plots. So we now know that at dry moisture contents and at high temperatures, we have a higher respiration happening from the warm plots. And what I then tried to investigate was, where is that carbon, all this extra carbon up here, where is that coming from? Is that depleting the soil store? And so this plot shows the soil organic carbon measured in all the plots. The stripy ones is the control plots, so that's the baseline. And the yellow-red ones is the warm plots. Now you can see there's not really a lot of change happening on the left side. That's the top soil. And in the deeper soil, it's actually the same. And if I really looked very carefully at that graph, maybe there's a slight increase in soil carbon. And so it looks like we're not losing soil carbon from the extra efflux. And this sort of led me down a little path in looking at the soil structure and whether the physical disruption of aggregate from the warming of the soil would make more carbon accessible, and then that would be respired. And to make a long story short, it did not. And it showed actually that warming slightly increased the soil structure, potentially actually protecting more carbon, which is a good story for silver plains specifically. So what I now am working on is that I've got the field conditions that lead to an increase in respiration. And I've run the laboratory incubations where I put little tiny bits of soil into different temperatures at different soil moisture levels. So I need to now put that all into a model so that I can predict and find out what conditions does this balance tip between a sink and a source. But at the moment, it looks like certainly in the field, we do have still a sink. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. That's really great to hear, actually, that we still have a sink out there, because there was that chat about it being a bit on a knife's edge coming from sink to source, depending on the conditions. We're now going to move to Bethany Yates, who is a master's student in the same lab with Professor Mark Hovenden, and this time she'll be looking at the vegetation communities and how they change in response or distance from the drains that we have across these marshlands.
Thanks very much, Kath. Today I'll be sharing some early findings from my master's research project. I have been looking at the impact of historically installed drainage canals on the functional composition of subalpine grasslands of the Central Plateau. And as Kath mentioned, this work is supervised by Professor Mark Hovenden and Professor Vanessa Adams. And it explores how these legacy drains that were dug by early European farmers across many highland grasslands in an effort to improve the palatability for grazing may be continuing to shape plant function. There we go. Thanks. So I'd like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal land on which my research takes place. My field sites are on the land of the Big River people, and my desktop work is on the land of the Muwinina people, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. My study sites span 7 sites within the Tasmanian Land Conservancy reserves across the Central Plateau. I've established 4 sites at Silver Plains, 2 at Five Rivers, and 1 at Pine Tier. And I've taken some creative licensing in naming the so far unnamed locations at each of these reserves. All these sites are classed as highland, poa grassland, or grassy sedgeland, and they're sitting between 800 and 900 metres elevation. These sites are relatively flat and gently sloping and have highly organic soils, as you've already heard about from Natasha. So these are very wet and peaty soils, and they have a critical impact on the plant assemblages in these highland grasslands. These subalpine plant communities are vulnerable to the warming climate, as with temperature rise and reduced precipitation, these sites are at a risk of losing the very wet and peaty conditions that the plant communities are specifically adapted to. This change is heightened by the presence of these human-made drains that draw water out of the system. However, these drains offer an opportunity for remediation. So they represent both a legacy threat and a potential management tool. As such, I'm interested in understanding the resilience of these plant communities to change through looking at the way the communities are structured in relation to both proximity to drains and also drain density. So the core question driving this research is, do historically installed drainage canals impact the functional composition of subalpine grassland communities? To explore these questions, I've used a stratified sampling design across 7 sites with varying drainage densities. At each site, I established transects perpendicular to the main drainage feature, and I sampled vegetation using the point intercept method at regular intervals. This generates species abundance data, which I'm using to understand more about community structure. I'll go on to use this data to assess the functional traits of the plants in the community and gain insight into the functional resilience. This is the ability of the ecosystem to maintain its function despite perturbation. This approach allows us to assess how plant communities vary with proximity to drains and whether the characteristics of the drains, like their density, are impacting plant community structure. And the aerial image you can see on your left there is of Bucks Marsh, and it just demonstrates how extensive these drain networks can be. So some early results that I found show that there is a relationship between the diversity of the plants in each plot that I surveyed in relation to their proximity to the drain. This graph shows each site with the most heavily drained on the left and the least heavily drained on the right. Each dot is a plot that I surveyed, and they are coloured according to their distance from the drain. When looking at all the sites together, diversity was greater closer to the drain. This indicates that as water flows into the drain, it creates a gradient of increasing wetness that supports more diversity. This is supported by data that also demonstrates that the soil water content was highest closest to the main drainage feature, and showing that there is a positive relationship between diversity and soil water content as well. When we break it down to look at the behaviour of some groups, we can see more neat relationships between percentage cover and distance from the drain. So forbs, which are herbaceous flowering plants, and sedges, such as the one you can see here, Carpa alpina, become less prevalent further from the drain, while Restianaceae, like Molluscium australe, and the grasses become more abundant with distance from the drain. And these results were very similar when I look at the relationship between group cover scores and soil water content as well. So this clearly demonstrates that drains and the associated alterations to the hydrology at each site are having an impact on the types and locations of plants present across the grassland. This indicates that the drains may be working as they were originally intended to make the landscape grassier, drier, and more palatable for grazing. So my next step is to expand this analysis by collecting functional trait data to better understand system resilience. Functional traits, which are measurable features like leaf area or growth form, reflect plant strategies and their roles in processing, such as nutrient cycling and decomposition. By looking at functional diversity and redundancy, I can assess whether key ecosystem functions are supported by many species or by just a few. High redundancy suggests that a system can better absorb species losses, while greater diversity means more strategies to cope with changing conditions. So in short, by looking at how communities respond to these historic drains, we gain insight into both their vulnerability and capacity for recovery. And this knowledge is really important as we consider the impacts of a changing climate, and as well as the restoration efforts that we're planning in the future. Thanks very much for listening, and thank you to TLC for access to these gorgeous lands.
Thanks, Beth. It's really great to have that fantastic baseline as we go forward with the restoration and think about how the plant communities may or may not change with that increased or restored hydrology. So keeping in the same theme of high soil carbon sites, we're now going to go across to NRE Tasmania and Rob Moreton, who will talk to us about or introduce Tasmanian's high soil carbon landscapes program.
Thank you, Kath, and thank you for the previous speakers for introducing so well the concepts around high organic soils and peats and carbon and the relevance. It makes my job a lot easier. So work out which screen to look at now. Thank you. So I belong within the Conservation Science section within NRE Tasmania. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who are going to be working on this project with me as well. Project manager Darren Kidd, our climate modeller Matt Webb, and our great tech officer Glenn Brown. I'd also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people in the areas that I am actually working, and that's going to be statewide. So I pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the important memories, the traditions, culture, and hopes of the Palawa people. So, what is the High Soil Carbon Landscapes project all about? It's there to improve our knowledge of soil, climate, ecosystems, and our traditional knowledge. It's a joint initiative between the Department of NRE and federal government. There's a lot of money involved, which is why I'm here to ask if people want to collaborate. We are very, very interested to spread that love around. We want to work with other people, other scientific organisations and groups. We want to focus our work into the areas that will get the best return for that money. The main project aim is to understand and raise awareness of the importance of carbon and high soil carbon soil landscapes. We want to set up a number of sites, over 200 individual profiles we want to collect, and we want to start to improve upon our existing mapping as well with that information and fine-tune the models that are used to create our organic soils map that's on this map at the moment. So it's trying to do a number of things. We also are keen to identify the main threats, some of which have been talked about at the moment, drainage being one of the key ones, and disturbance from development as well. We are very proud of the fact that we can go in both reserved and non-reserved land, so we're tenure blind, so that opens up a lot of landscapes to us. So what are our high carbon landscapes then? These are landscapes characterised by soils that are containing a lot of organic material, and for the purposes of this project we're saying that there at least has to be a 5 centimetre thick organic layer with greater than 12% organic carbon. Obviously, as the previous speakers have indicated, the accumulation rate of organic material outstrips the rate of decomposition through respiration processes mainly, but other impacts as well. Over time, deep accumulations of peat occur, and we can see that globally there's a domination of that in the northern hemisphere. Some around the equatorial areas, not very much in the southern hemisphere, but Tassie and New Zealand and parts of South America are blessed with quite an abundance of these soils and landscapes. So globally they're important. They only cover 3% of the Earth's surface, yet they contribute to 30% of the Earth's land-based carbon, and that's mostly below ground. So there's significant landscapes to look at and undertake the work. So, to next slide. So we want to use the information that we collect to fine-tune the existing soil map, the organic soil map on this map. We want to highlight the importance of our soil carbon stock within Tasmania, and it's not unusual to have a very, very high 50% organic carbon in the top 10 centimetres of your soil, so that equates to 125 tonnes per hectare. Now, as you can tell, if you have a very deep peat, that's going to add up quite quickly and be quite significant in the point of view of a sink for our carbon, but also if we have an ability to restore that wetland as well, it can go on and sequester more carbon going forward. We want to promote new and existing management and decision support tools, such as the Parks and Wildlife fire teams that are now using an app to collect soil information when they're doing their planning for planned burns. Thank you. And we want to also contribute to the climate conversation as well, because a lot of the current calculations that are being used for climate change do not use soil carbon, or they use estimates for soil carbon within them. So this is an area where we can actually start to calibrate and quantify the amount of carbon in our landscape and inject that information into the calculations. Part of the project is also designed to incorporate some Aboriginal knowledge and look at high significance of these areas culturally and capture that information and work with community in doing some community involvement on country as well, and some learning opportunities both ways. Last slide. Oop. I can't go backwards with this one. That's a trick. There we go. Okay. The other side is that we want to help build some capacity through training and mentoring. We'll be putting 2 new staff, soils-based staff on for the project. So hopefully get some additional development for uni graduates and technical people. And particularly, we want to raise the awareness of the importance of these landscapes going forward. And I thank everyone in the room, actually, because most of your work is actually underpinned by a lot of these soils and the link to biodiversity and important species. So I'll leave it at that. If you want to collaborate, there's the QR code and get in touch.
Thanks, Rob. We're really excited to collaborate, both from understanding the values of our reserve, but also contributing to that statewide data set to help improve that in the modelling across Tassie. We're now going to swing across to the Vale of Belvoir, and our conservation ecologist Amy Bliss is going to talk to us about the trends that we're seeing post-grazing removal at the Vale of Belvoir.
Hi everyone, thanks Kath. Yes, so today I'm going to talk about a couple of our very special threatened species that occur on the Vale of Belvoir and what's happening to them following the removal of cattle. How do I use this? So the Vale of Belvoir, a lot of you will be familiar with it. It's the lands of the Notalia people, and it's an incredibly beautiful subalpine valley located in Tasmania's northwest. It became a TLC reserve in 2008, and it's around 500 hectares of montane grassy sedgeland over basalt and limestone. And the dominant communities that occur in this open area are threatened vegetation communities, which are represented in this graph in the orange and yellow. And these communities are habitat for numerous threatened species, both flora and fauna. But the couple I'm going to focus on today, they both have significant populations at the Vale, and they're both threatened at a state and national level. And these are the Tanara brown butterfly and grassland paper daisy. So both of these species are dependent on healthy grasslands. Tanara need both mature tussock and a diversity of herbs and flowers for their caterpillars and their adult butterflies to feed on.
while the grassland paper daisy needs open grasslands, especially with areas of bare ground where they can germinate. And healthy, diverse grasslands require disturbance. So fire or grazing removes the thick vegetation and it creates space for herbs to grow, and it stops these areas converting into shrublands or forests. So importantly, the Vale of Belvoir, it is a cultural landscape. So it's been maintained through active fire management by Palawa people for millennia. And post-colonisation, this area was managed for seasonal cattle grazing, so by two families. So cattle were brought up into this area over summer and taken off the land in winter. And the landholders during that period continued to conduct spring burns quite regularly to create that fresh green pick for the cattle to feed on. Since TLC have been managing the land from 2008, we've continued to maintain a mosaic burning regime. And initially we maintained the cattle until we knew more about what impacts they were having on natural values. There was a study conducted that found that the cattle were having negative impacts, especially on the wetlands, and the stock were all taken off the land in 2001. But we really want to understand what the impact this change in land management is having on our natural values. So this is a summary of some of the monitoring data we've been collecting since then. So this is the 3 threatened vegetation communities. It's our long-term vegetation monitoring that was started in 2015. And you can see from 2020 that we're having an increase in condition in those communities, especially in the Diplerina sedgeland and the Poa grassland, which is the green and the red lines. And if you look at this graph on the right, you can see an increase in communities going from moderate to good condition. Our butterflies, which are monitored annually, are also seeing an increase in population numbers from 2020 until this year. And again, this is most prominent in the Highland Poa grassland, which this time is in green. And when we look at these together, so on these graphs, you can see the dashed line's vegetation condition and the solid line is the Tanara populations. You can see that these two seem to have a relationship where the Tanara populations size seem to be matching vegetation condition, which is really interesting. As for the grassland paper daisy, we've been seeing a decline in the population since 2011. We did see a positive increase this year. However, those overall numbers are much smaller than they were when we started monitoring. And we're also seeing a contraction in the extent of the population, especially in this one we call sleeping dragon. So do cows have anything to do with it? This map shows the distribution of cow pats, density of cow pats across the Vale. And you can see they're mostly using the flat areas in the south and the north. This map shows the pink is where the grassland paper daisy is, which is up on the hills. So they don't seem to be using the same areas. Whereas the Tanara are spread out across the Vale, but they're mostly in 2003 in the north, in the flat areas. And in 2005, we see that they're coming into the southern areas where the cows were. So in conclusion, this shows that the removal of stock is at least having a positive effect, and it might be influencing the vegetation condition and Tanara populations. And the paper daisy decline is probably not related because they weren't using the same range. And we're prioritising to burn the paper daisy's habitat. It is early days, so we're going to continue monitoring, see how these trends change over time. And for the moment, we will continue to work with our native herbivores. Oops. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. It's been great to turn that around because we were looking at the Tanaras and the Tanara change in the Tanara populations. and only just starting to look in at that vegetation community change as well, and looking how they coincide and differ. We're now going to swing our attention across to deer control across the Central Highlands, and we're going to start with Dr. Jared Dale from NRE Tasmania, who'll be outlining the monitoring following the fallow deer aerial culling that was taken around the Twa.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, good day, everyone. I'm Jara. I'm coming to you from NRE TAS today, and I'll be talking about the ongoing monitoring we're doing in response to the ongoing cull of fallow deer in the Central Highlands. The country I'm talking about today is between Yingina, Great Lake, and Willentakala Cradle Mountain, and I'm sure we all have personal connections with those places. And I would like, while I'm speaking today about this really tricky problem, that you all think about your own connection to these places and how important they are to all of us and the wider Tasmanian community. Oh, sorry. Well, it doesn't really matter, actually. This work's funded under an Australian Heritage Grant, which funds heritage projects across Australia in preservation and protection, especially World Heritage Sites. Our grant was funded in 2023 and had two main aims. The first one is the eradication of deer within the Walls of Jerusalem National Park, which is what I'll focus on today. So our heritage area is the Tasmanian Wilderness Wood Heritage Area, or the TWA, and specifically I'll be talking today about the Central Plateau Conservation Area in grey and the Walls of Jerusalem in brown, which is what you can see there. So before this study or this program took place, we went out and we kind of surveyed the known data and the actual area for how dense deer were. And we broke up that landscape into three main categories: low, medium, and high density, from things like the NVA and deer scan, which you all might use. So that all helped us understand what deer were already doing. So we had the landscape broken up into those categories, and we also included the TLC property skull bone. So that is how we fit into here. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, I'm talking about the cull. I'm mostly talking about the monitoring, but I'm also going to briefly go over the cull because I'm sure we're all very interested in what's gone on over the last 3 years in the Highlands. Before the culling within this program took place, 1,000 deer were removed from this landscape. And then over the course of the next 3 years, we removed 1,200 deer, starting with approximately 700 deer in 2023. Around 300 deer in 2024, including the only two that were removed from Walls of Jerusalem National Park. And this year we removed a further 313 from the landscape. Parks and Wildlife could have removed much more, but we ran out of money for helicopter hours, which might give you an idea of just how many deer are out there in that landscape. In terms of monitoring, we had 5 sites per each of those density zones. And then 5 reference sites, so we knew deer were really high anyway, and we weren't going to do any kind of further modification except for in skullbone. The monitoring sites looked like a square, and at each of the point of the square we had a camera trap set up for a month pre-cull, during the cull, and a month post-cull. And then at each of those 4 points of the square we also did a systematic survey of deer signs, so scat, footmarks, if a deer was actually on the site when we were there. What we found during the course of the cull and the monitoring effort is that we weren't getting bang for our buck, so to speak. And we pivoted away from doing across the landscape of Walls of Jerusalem and the Central Plateau, from focusing on the low and the medium sites as equally as the high sites. So we weren't getting many deers actually being culled in the low and the medium sites, or actually being identified on the cameras. So for this last year in 2025, we actually just focused on 4 sites for monitoring, which is also what the culling effort was focused on. So we had 3 sites that we monitored for 3 years, and then that 6H site up there was just monitored for this year for a bit of spatial diversity. If you look at that site 3H, if you can all see that, that was actually the only site this year we got deer post-cull sighted on. So just keep that in mind as I go through the results of the monitoring program about where it is. It's obviously on the edge of the Twa. So the results I'm about to present, even though we have results for all those sites across the 3 years, except for 6H for this year, I'm only going to present those four for a bit of completeness. So we're obviously seeing a staged reduction in deer numbers in those areas. The recruitment was about 64% lower this year than it was previously, but it's kind of puzzling, isn't it? We've got quite a lot of post-deer records this year. So we kind of thought, what's that about? And kind of delving a bit further into it, 2023, 2024 had very similar patterns of removal, whereas in 2025, we see a maintenance or increase of female deer in our survey efforts. And this could be a result of only that one camera picking up deer, or it could be something interesting and demographic. On the mainland, when red deer are have a sustained culling effort applied on them, you often see demographic shifts with increased numbers of females moving and migrating into areas, post multiple years of culling. So it kind of requires a few more years of monitoring to understand exactly what the demographic pressure might be on the deer population. And just really briefly, this data has really interestingly been applied to multiple different modelling efforts, including 2 papers that have already been published that I'm sure you're all aware of, and then also further publications that are in progress now. And the interesting thing is, all modelling efforts seem to say that the deer density should be low in the Twa, that the habitat suitability for deer is low in the Twa, but yet we're constantly getting repeated incursions, and we're, constant, culling and monitoring effort is required to understand what's going on with the deer. We actually, Parks and Wildlife recently were successful in getting a second AHG grant to continue this monitoring effort. And we have set up sentinel cameras in the walls of Jerusalem to try and understand when and where they're moving in that landscape. This was a huge project. I'm only very new to it, and I'm very thankful that I've been a part of it. I'm thankful to be here today. Our main partner, Parks and Wildlife Service, has been incredible and a real supportive partner. And if you guys want to do extra work with deer or ongoing monitoring with deer, yes, the CSS team and Parks and Wildlife are always keen to hear from you. And that's me.
Thanks, Jara. That's fantastic to see, and congratulations on the next grant to get the next round done. That's amazing. It's certainly something that we're also seeing on our cameras, where for the first time following the aerial culls done by Parks and NRA, we're actually seeing reduced detections, and to the point in Skullbone that we're not getting detections. It doesn't mean they're not there, they're just there at lower numbers. But just to even see that is fantastic, to have that support and ongoing management. And I guess pertinent to what Jara was discussing there about the continued invasion into the Twa and the limitations, we're now going to welcome Tom Guy to the stage, and he's going to present his PhD work, which is looking at the diet of fallow deer and the implications for invasion ecology.
Thanks, Kev. Hi, my name is Tom, and I'm an ecologist and a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. I'd like to start by acknowledging the first inhabitants of this island, Lutruwita, the Palawa, the Te Ari Nutipana, Mawirina, and the Ruli Imina, where this research was conducted. Today, I'll be presenting findings from a recent study on the diet of fallow deer in Tasmania, which suggests that their broad dietary niche will enable them to expand further into new habitats, including those of high conservation value, such as the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area.
Just did it for you.
Okay. Cool. All right, so why study deer diet? Native herbivores strongly influence vegetation structure and composition globally. Understanding what they eat helps us forecast their ecological impacts, especially for invasive species like fallow deer. Diet data is critical to predicting how widely an invasive species might spread and what types of habitats that they could occupy. A flexible diet allows for animals to adapt to new environments and put pressure on a broader range of native plants. Fallow deer are now one of the most widely distributed ungulate species globally due to human translocation. Originally native to a small region in Anatolia, they have established throughout Europe, North America, South America, New Zealand, South Africa and Australia, including much of Tasmania. They prefer landscapes with both forest and grassland and are considered an intermediate feeder, browsing shrubs but favouring grasses, especially in the growing season. This flexibility in their diet may enable them to expand well beyond their core range of the grassy midlands. We compared deer diets between a lowland site in the Midlands, where they've been established for over 150 years, and 3 highland sites where they've continued to spread. Silver Plains and Five Rivers Reserve, owned and managed by the TLC, and the edge of the Twa at Arthur's Lake. So using environmental DNA to analyse faecal pellets, or deer poo, samples were queried against a nucleotide database GenBank, as well as a custom database generated from plant specimens collected at the sites. Taxa were assigned to the species level where possible, or drop back to the lowest common ancestor if multiple taxonomic assignments were given. Data were further curated by removing taxa that were unlikely to be a match, as in not found in the study area. This was done with the help of the late distinguished Professor Jamie Kirkpatrick, allowing for additional resolution in taxonomic assignments. Fallow deer consumed a wide range of plant species across all sites. This included bryophytes, ferns, orchids, grasses, sedges, rushes. Shrubs were found in 50% of the samples and trees in 70%. Aquatic taxa were present in 10% of the samples. Both native and exotic plants were eaten. In all, 52 genera from 30 families were detected and 44 taxa were identified to the species level. Most common taxa were Asteraceae, so the daisy family at the family level, with 37.5% of all the scats. Eucalyptus at a genus level, which was in 60% of the scats, and Gonocarpus tetragynus at the species level in 50% of the scats. Deer diets were highly variable. In the Midlands, they primarily consumed forbs and grasses, and in the Highlands, we saw a shift towards woody species, including eucalypts. As we know from other research and long-term monitoring efforts, deer abundance has been increasing annually at around 12%, resulting in a 40-fold increase from 1985 to 2019. The core distribution has increased 3-fold in this 35-year period and now spans approximately 27% of Tasmania's land area. Satellite populations have established in locations where farm deer have escaped or been released, demonstrating that humans have facilitated some of this recent range expansion. Climate and habitat suitability modelling predicts that 50% of Tasmania is suitable under the current climate. Deer's capacity to switch from grazing to browsing means that they can establish in habitats with fewer grasses. This raises concerns for ecosystems like alpine forests and the Twa, which are home to slow-growing or endangered plant species vulnerable to herbivory. An example of this is the destruction that can occur is cytogums at Five Rivers Reserve, which have been heavily browsed since the 2018-2019 Great Pine Tier Fire. And as a result, TLC have taken to caging cytogums to reduce browsing pressure. So given their flexible diet and expanding range, management efforts should focus on preventing deer establishment in unoccupied but vulnerable areas, increasing efforts in areas of high conservation value, or in areas with a contained range, for example, Bruny Island. Actions could include more strategic culling, exclusion fencing, and ongoing research to monitor their impacts. So the take-home message is that fallow deer in Tasmania have a broad, flexible diet, and this means that diet won't limit their spread. Without proactive management, they will continue expanding into ecologically important areas. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. That was another really important part of that puzzle on how we might go forward with managing deer into the future. I'd like to invite all of the speakers back up to the stage and for a round of questions. Yeah, Tom's like, nope. Oh. Okay, pleased. I might just intersperse a few of these with the online questions, starting with a question for Natasha, which is, could you say how much soil carbon, e.g. grams per metre square, the increased carbon flux, efflux, might correspond to over a year? Would you like that again?
I could, but I need my computer. Sorry, I don't have that number on me, but it's a lot. So the percentage organic carbon in those soils is about 15% in the topsoil. So that gives you an indication of how much that might be, and a bulk density of around 0.5 grams per cubic centimeter. And then you can do the calculation. Yeah, so I don't plan to use a model that integrates, well, basically a model known. I'm planning to use the measurements that I have from the field and integrate that with the measurements I have from the laboratory under controlled conditions, and then with these integrate these key mechanisms that I've found to be valid in the field to create my own model for the field site specifically. Because when I look at literature out there, what we see is that the key regulators of this is so dependent on the actual site, so it's really specific. So I might be able to use another model, but it makes more sense for this purpose to make something that works for this site.
Thanks. A couple of very quick questions for Tom. One is about impact of deer. Have there been any controlled experiments where deer have been excluded from areas and the comparison made between the areas where they are and they aren't in a properly designed experiment?
Just the first chapter of my PhD, just a general diet study. But yeah, I've set up 120 plots between Silver Plains, Five Rivers Reserve, and a site in the Midlands that exclude deer but allow all other herbivores to gain access. And that's been ongoing since 2019. And sort of got the results from that. That's just still writing that up at the moment.
Well, don't keep us in suspense.
But yeah, that'll be the next talk.
So can I just very quick follow up with that? Have you been able to distinguish between the effects of them grazing versus the effect of having hard hoofed animals in an environment that evolve where the animals, all have soft pads?
Yeah, that's another really great question and an important thing to look at. It's not something that I've looked at in my PhD. Mine's sort of become more focused in their impacts on woody vegetation and the impacts on eucalypt recruitment. But some of those early results just show that deer are having as much of an impact, sort of equal to all the other native herbivores combined when it comes to eucalypt recruitment.
Hey.
This is a question for Rob, and I'm sure I should already know the answer to this question. It's a very basic one, and that is, what is the reason for the difference between the northern and the southern hemisphere? So much more up in the northern hemisphere of high carbon soils. Might just be because of the distribution of land and oceans, but I'm curious anyway.
Mostly because of the temperature involved with the tundra areas and the ice caps up there. We're very interspersed with oceans and warming environments here. However, those warming or environments are great growth of vegetation as well. So probably seeing a shift of northern more active type.
Stop you. So from online, Beth, I have a question for you. Do you have any measure of the magnitude of the effect of the drain on the soil hydrology? How far from the drain can the impact persist?
So that's definitely something that I'm going to be looking at next. Something I will be looking at is drain density. So I have different drain densities for different sites. But in terms of magnitude, that is something that would definitely be interesting to look at, maybe using like GIS to understand more about the volume of water that's being moved out of the system. And I haven't looked into that yet, but I anecdotally think that, yeah, there would probably be quite a strong effect. And from what I've seen already, which is just very early results, is that, yeah, you do get those drier conditions further away from the drain. So it definitely is kind of pulling that water away and impacting that plant community. Yeah.
Some exciting work to follow up as we go forward with the drainage restoration. Jara, I did have a bit of a question around what's happening with the culls going forward. So you have a grant, or Parks or NRE have a grant to go forward, and they'll focus on the same area as last year? Or
Yeah, it's not really my remit, that stuff. I just put cameras out. But no, the next AHG grant is mostly focused on refining the monitoring to like and the cull effort. So it's like it's another 3-year grant, I think. If Yasmin was here, I think she's watching. Sorry, Yasmin, I'm going to butcher this. If she were here, she would tell you all about it. But I think it's to evaluate and to kind of refine that risk model to look at where incursions are going to happen, considering that everything that so far has told us that the TWA shouldn't be where they are, but it is. So why? So there will be a cull component, but it's mostly looking at refining those models and actually giving us a better story around why they're living in this beautiful area. Hope that's okay, Yasmin.
thanks, Jara, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but also, I mean, super exciting to be able to share this information between the organisations and as well with what we're trying to do out at Silver Plains over the coming time. And there is a question over there from Andrew.
I've just got a question for Dr. Jarradale. The pre and post cull monitoring, given the pretty stark seasonal motions of fallow deer and how they group and what kind of climate, where they want to be at different times of year, I know personally there's a difficulty in repeat monitoring when you're trying to get multiple monitoring sessions in the same year and you don't know whether you're measuring that behaviour, actual presence. And I see a rhythm in your pre-cull monitoring's very high every year, and then you've got the drop. What's the kind of gap between your pre and post-cull monitoring? Are they within the same window of animal activity, or is it like, one's before mating season and one's during winter when all the males have run off and the does are just with that latest fawn?
The culls take place in May every year, so the monitoring takes place like flanked that. So ideally, the behavior should be the same, but then you take into account that if you're putting this novel cull pressure on a population, they're going to behave differently a few years, which I think is what we're seeing now, 3 years post like intensive culling. There's obviously limitations to how we monitored. We started off with a huge array of sites, and the just logistical power of getting to all of them became too much for the grant to kind of buffer, which is why we went to that smaller subset of sites. But that's what this next grant is looking at, is like, how can we, for the best bang for your buck, understand how monitoring can be more effectively used rather than what we tested, which probably wasn't sufficient for actually picking up population drops or trends. Even though we have seen a reduction, I think it needs to be more, that's what this next grant is, making it more rigorous. So seasonally, they should have been doing the same thing, but, you know, if you ask, personally, I think they probably have, in this third year, they probably changed their behavior quite a lot in response to what would have been a very naive population is now very cluey and very stressed.
Again, just following on Jara. So are the deer strategically killed sort of like males, females, or are they just culled according to which animals are spotted? How does that work, the culling process? Is there a strategy as to which animals will be most effectively culled, so to speak?
So basically any deer that's sighted is culled. And in those high density areas, as I said, they ran out of money rather than run out of deer to shoot. So it was less of a targeted effort in terms of, gender. You think, so in terms of this project, this culling effort, which was both on ground and chopper based, that might be different if you also engaged hunters who are interested in a certain type of deer. But I can't really speak to that specific side of things, which is why we definitely weren't targeting females, which is why this increase in females this year is kind of interesting. But it was generalist, and there's a lot of deer, so as many as we could.
I can add a little bit to that, where we would be trying to cull 35% of the population just to maintain them at a non-growth phase. So when we're working on our reserves, that would be our target, is to get over 35% of the population. And that includes really looking at the does as well. So not just being focused on the stags, which, you know, is the traditional target, but making sure we're taking out females in those spring months and at least 25% of their population. I might just swing it around to a question to Amy, which is, you talked about two of our threatened species that have slightly different requirements, where we have Tanaras and who don't like to be burnt, and then we've got our leucochrysums, or the paper daisies, that need to be burnt. How did the Tanaras respond post-fire with some of our burns out there?
Importantly, we're burning in a mosaic pattern, so we're not burning all of the Tanara habitat at once. And they do require that burning to regenerate and refreshen their grasslands that they're dependent on. So they don't like it at the time, but in the long term, it's beneficial for the species. Also, we are currently targeting burning the hill where the leucochrysum, the grassland paper daisy, is, where the populations of Tanaras aren't as big as in the lowland areas. And I suspect they probably come up to the areas after they're burnt, and sort of move around the landscape as well. So they're still doing really well in the landscape.
I'll just ask them to break. It's fine. Nah, don't worry about it.
Slightly longer break between coffee this time, where we need to be back by 5.